The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar, Funding for New Apprenticeships. Our sincere apologies for those of you who tried to join us yesterday. I'm afraid we did have network issues and had to cancel the webinar after trying for about 15 minutes. So thank you for your patience and welcome again today. This webinar is the third and last in our popular series, and we thank you all for joining us. We will be looking to launch a new series after the Easter break, so please look out for that. So before I introduce you to our main speaker, I'd just like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of the experience today. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. To engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panel. Using the tabs of this panel, you can adjust your audio settings and choose to see the webcam of our presenter. During our webinar, we'll be running a number of polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. You can also use the panel on the right, the question and chat tabs to engage with us and send in your questions. We will do our best to answer your questions and queries in a Q&A session at the end. So before we begin our webinar, I'd like to start with two quick polls and then we'll introduce our speaker, Bryony. Firstly, are you an FE college or a private training provider? The answers being FE college, private training provider, or neither of the above. We'll vote now, please. Thank you very much. And secondly, what best describes your job role, please? Tutor assessor, head of department, vice principal, principal, business development manager, head of curriculum, or other. Please vote now. Thank you all. After today's webinar, we will be providing a recording, a copy of the slide deck, and a fact sheet to address any unanswered questions. That's all of the admin from me. I'd now like to hand over to our presenter, Bryony Kingland, UK Funding Manager at City & Guilds.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Today, I know some of you will have obviously attended the session or logged on for the session that Bill Twigg did a few weeks ago, and Bill did cover some of the apprenticeship funding. Today we are going to go into a bit more detail about the new apprenticeship funding and the apprenticeship funding arrangements. So the first thing we're going to look at, or have a little bit of an overview from, Lynn, if you could just flip to the next slide for me, is the apprenticeship funding for 16-17. In late February, the Skills Funding Agency published the new funding rules for both apprenticeship frameworks and for apprenticeship standards and for the adult education budget and for the adult advanced learner loans. In fact, they published quite a few documents in one go, rather than the usual sort of two documents. We used to have funding rates and formula and funding rules and eligibility, and now we have a plethora of documents to keep us busy and entertained. Excellent bedtime reading if you're an insomniac, should keep you very well sleeping very well. The two documents that really are relevant for us are the next two, if we can go to the next. The combined funding rules for apprenticeship frameworks and the combined funding rules for apprenticeship standards. I've done a thorough analysis and a lot of reading and slept very well over the last few weeks whilst I've gone through these to try and bring you the information from today. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just have a quick overview here of what the current apprenticeship forms are, just to remind anybody who didn't attend any of the previous seminars or is not aware. So the government is basically committed to achieving 3 million apprenticeship targets starts by 2020. To enable this, they're going to implement the following. First of all, the apprenticeship levy, which comes in on the 6th of April 2017. And that will be 0.5% of an employer pay bill if they've got a pay bill of 3 million or more. That's actually only 2% of the employer population in the UK. So 98% of employers will not be paying the levy, and we've yet to hear any information from George Osborne or from the Department of Business Innovation and Skills about what will happen post 16-17, 17-18 with those employers and how they will be funded. We think from the hints and tips we're being given that it's likely that there will still be a 1/3, 2/3 contributory approach, which is currently the employer pays 1/3 and the government contributes 2/3. We may hear news about this in the budget, which is next Wednesday. The Chancellor is doing a budget next Wednesday in Parliament, so some of you may want to watch out for that. We may not hear anything further until autumn this year. But as soon as we have any information on that, of course, we will let you know and do some more webinars about it probably. There's an enterprise bill that will seek to introduce statutory targets for public sector of 2.3%. So any public sector bodies that don't currently run apprenticeships from 16-17, they will have to start running apprenticeships. There's also a relevant government contract for 10 million or more. Those contracts will have to have a proportion of their workforce as apprentices as well. Then there's the new apprenticeship standards, which are written and owned by groups of employers and which will slowly replace the current apprenticeship frameworks, the SACE apprenticeship frameworks, and we reckon it's likely that most of the apprenticeship frameworks will be gone by 2020. The Skills Funding Agency actually removed 7 frameworks earlier on this week, late last week, because they've already been replaced by the new apprenticeship standards. So they are slowly going to be reduced over the course of the next 2 or 3 years until we are fully transferred over to standards. And then finally, they are implementing an Institute of Apprenticeships. That's the IFA, not the IOA, apparently. The employer-run body will oversee quality of standards, but they're also going to look at ongoing governance, i.e. when does an apprenticeship standard need to be replaced or rewritten because there's been changes in the skills needs. And they're also going to be working with BIS on the funding of those standards and how much of a funding cap should be applied and what the funding should look like. So moving on from that, key dates for everybody to be aware of. First of all, in February 16, employers can start posting their vacancies on the new Find an Apprenticeship tool, which the SFA and the National Apprenticeship Service have instigated. And in April 16, there will be an end of national insurance contributions for apprentices that are under 25. I think it's worth all providers knowing this, because if you're the experts about apprenticeships, then you can keep your employees that you're working with well informed and up to speed. So being expert about what is happening and being able to pass on this information is always useful. SACE frameworks, that's the current apprenticeship frameworks, and new standards will continue to be running side by side, because obviously a lot of apprenticeship standards are still being written. In April 17, the levy starts, and also the Digital Apprenticeship System, that's the DAS, will launch, and that is the system that will offer employers information about their levy and information about providers. I've got another slide about that later, so I'll touch on that a bit more. And in August 2017, the age grant finishes. It will end at that point. In August 17, and this is important to any providers that are online on the webinar, the Skills Funding Agency will no longer allocate you funds for delivering apprenticeships. If you're going to deliver apprenticeships, you need to have arranged the funding with your employers that you're currently working with. We'll still be running dual SACE apprenticeship frameworks and also the new apprenticeship standards, but with maximum starts on the apprenticeship standards, and SACE is likely to be fully replaced in 2020 by new standards. We need to do a poll here. Right, at this point we're going to do a poll just asking a few questions about, more about apprenticeships. It would be great to see where you are with it and what your experience and background is.
Okay, thank you, Bryony. So we want to ask you specifically about your understanding of the levy. How well developed is your understanding of the levy and the Digital Apprenticeship Service? Very well developed. I understand all there is to know. I have some idea but not fully informed. I've heard of it but know very little. Or what is the levy and DAS? Please vote now. Okay, so about 60% of you are saying that you have some idea but not fully informed.
Well, hopefully today, after the webinar, you'll feel a little bit, I hope you'll feel a little bit more informed. We can probably do a poll at the end and find out if that is the case. So a little bit more about the Digital Apprenticeship Service and the levy. So by April 2017, the Digital Apprenticeship System will be in place. It's currently being piloted by Department of Business Innovation and Skills and the SFA with a small number of providers and a small number of employers. So one would hope, by the time we get to April 2017, that we've actually got a system that works and that it'll be up and running and it'll work effectively for everybody. The levy tax, call it what you will, it is a tax. I think we need to be clear about that, regardless of what the government is saying. It is definitely a tax. Will be collected from April the 6th by HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue Service. And then for that first 4 months, the HMRC will collect that levy so that by the time we reach April the 1st, there will be money in the employer levy accounts to enable them to start spending on apprenticeship standards directly with providers. So really, as providers, you haven't from now until 31st of July 2017 to make sure that you've established what you're going to be delivering with the employers that you work with and any future employers, and also how they're going to pay you. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that later. One thing you should know is that the digital service will also include a list of education providers, what apprenticeships you offer. So I think the Skills Funding Agency is going to be using their course catalogue that you all fill in for putting that up. We may hear more about that later, but it'll tell employers what apprenticeships you offer, in what geographical area. We'll also offer information about your performance as providers. So it's going to give information about your Ofsted outcomes and possibly your success rates and any other outcome generation sort of data that the Skills Funding Agency feels is pertinent. We'll know more about that later this year. The digital system might also show details for assessment organisations that are registered, but we're waiting to hear about that yet. We don't know fully whether that's going to be the case or they'll be using another system for that. The reality is the Digital Apprenticeship Service will allow employers to purchase directly from you as providers, and they will make payments to you via the Digital Apprenticeship Service. Now, there's been a consultation recently about how that system might work and how payments might occur, and I went in as a sort of fake employer to fill in the forms and fill in the questions to find out what sort of questions they're asking, to give me an idea about what the Skills Funding Agency's thoughts are about how employers might pay providers. What it indicated to me is that they're looking potentially at a monthly payment system. So the employers will pay providers monthly, but there will be points when they can either stop payments or when they can make changes to payments. But we've yet to hear the outcome of that consultation. It is now closed, so there should be a report coming out on that soon. But in real terms, the cash will flow from the employer to the providers via the Digital Apprenticeship Service, rather than as it currently does via the Skills Funding Agency and your contracts, because the contracts will finish from 31st of July and the SFA will no longer pay you. So, on to funding and how the Digital Apprenticeship System will work. This is just a quick infographic. So basically, employers with a pay bill of over 3 million, they will have their levy collected by HMRC, who will then download into the Digital Apprenticeship Service information that tells the employer what funding they've got to spend on apprenticeships. Apprenticeship design is with stakeholder oversight. So stakeholder oversight basically means the Institute for Apprenticeships, the employer groups that have written that particular standard, who they are encouraging to remain as governance groups for those standards, and any other bodies involved such as sector skills councils and potentially BIS and the SFA whilst they still exist. There'll be individual employer voucher accounts or levy account, and the employers will then pay the providers directly via that account. So the information flow here is the money flow comes from apprenticeship funding via DAS straight to the provider, and the information flows backwards and forwards between the provider and the employer and the Digital Apprenticeship Service, the digital system, call it what you will. So just to sort of reiterate how the levy works, and I think it's important for providers to understand this so that, again, you can be the experts for your employers. An employer with a pay bill of 2 million, basically their levy sum of 0.5% would be 10,000. There's no levy to pay because the total levy amount is less than the 15,000 allowance that each employer gets. But in example 2, if an employer has a pay bill of 5 million and the levy sum is 0.5%, they pay 25,000. So minus the levy allowance of 15,000, their annual levy to pay will be 10,000. So the allowance is not an amount paid to the employer, it's a percentage amount of allowed pay bill of funding before the levy is due. So it's very much like PAYE. And the pay bill is calculated on total employee earnings, benefits in kind, pensions, etc. are not included. Any employer that has a multiple payroll will only be able to claim the 15k allowance once. They're not allowed to claim it for multiple payrolls. So they just get a one 15k allowance. So apprenticeship funding, you may have all seen this table. In the latest SFA funding rules, they flagged that we now have 6 funding caps rather than 5. This will still apply, this funding approach will still apply in 16-17. Skills Funding Agency have said that they will publish further information in the autumn about whether they're going to change this funding arrangement. So they may decide to change the funding caps. We're just not sure how they're going to do it. So look forward to autumn when we may be doing more webinars to inform you how the funding might work if they do decide to change it. But for 16-17, we've still got the 6 funding caps. The employer still has to spend £1 for every £2 the government contributes up to the maximum cap. What that means is that the employer does not have to pay the full funding cap, or doesn't have to. Basically, I can ask the provider for a discount. So if they came to you saying, well, the core government funding contribution is 6,000, therefore I'm meant to contribute 3,000. I only want to contribute 2,000, therefore you will only get 4,000. Are you prepared to deliver the apprenticeship for this funding? And you can say yes or no. I think the other thing to also flag here is employer cash contributions must be in the form of transfer of funding that is visible in some shape or form to audit. So both the employer and the lead provider must have visible evidence of the employer payment via their financial systems. Whether you do that via the ILR, whether you do it via an invoicing system, is totally up to you, but the value of each cash payment must be recorded in the ILR, and you as providers will not receive any money from the Skills Funding Agency until you're showing employer cash in your ILR send-in. So if the employer says, I'm not going to pay you any money for the first 3 months, you will not get any money for delivery in the first 3 months until the employer has paid you funding. So when you make those arrangements with your employers for when they're going to make payments to you in the initial negotiations, it's really important that you make sure you've got enough cash up front from that employer to start delivery, and that you can show it in your ILR, because the SFA will not pay you any funding until your ILR shows that the employer's made contributions. And you need to retain all of that information for audit purposes for the Skills Funding Agency. Although it's interesting to think who is actually going to fund you, because as we all know, the Skills Funding Agency is going through another restructure, so there will be a lot less staff. So at the moment, we don't know how that audit is going to occur and who's going to be auditing, but they will want you to retain that information for audit. There's also the apprenticeship incentives that can be claimed by you and the employer. And as you see this table here, it really varies as to what they can get. But before they can actually get incentives, employers must make that co-payment towards training and or the endpoint assessment. They can't receive incentive payments unless they've made that co-contribution. So employers choosing to deliver all of their training and endpoint assessment in-house would not be eligible for any of those incentives. It's got to be that co-payment arrangement between providers and between employers. So the lead provider receives incentives at different times to pay to the employer. So for example, first of all, the 16 to 18 incentive, you get 50% 90 days from the apprentice's start, and the remaining 50% is 365 days from the apprentice start. So if you've got a 12-month apprenticeship, they can get 50% of the 16 to 18 incentive at 3 months in, and then the remaining 50% at the end of that 1-year apprenticeship. The small employer incentive is paid 100% after the first 90 days. So after the first 3 months, they can then claim that. And 100% of the completion incentive is only paid once the apprentice has successfully completed and the endpoint assessment organisation has claimed the certificate and sent it to you to send on to your learner, because it's the endpoint assessment organisation that claims the apprenticeship certificate once endpoint assessment has taken place. So you can't pay that 100% or claim it from the SFA until everything's been completed up front. Also, just finally, employers must confirm their eligibility for incentive payments to their lead provider through a signed employer eligibility declaration. So there has to be some sort of declaration that they are eligible, i.e. they have to confirm they are a small business of less than 50 employees, and obviously you as the provider would confirm that there's a 16 to 18-year-old and also that they've successfully completed. But the employer must confirm to you, and you must again keep that as audit evidence. So there's a lot of bureaucracy realistically in that at the moment, but I'm hoping that Skills Funding Agency is going to look to reduce some of that bureaucracy whilst they're looking at the funding, but we'll wait and see in the autumn. So going further on to the rules of apprenticeships. Ooh, we've got a slide here. Not ready for it. Oh no, sorry everybody, I missed a slide there, turned over the page too early. So some of the apprenticeship rules. As you know, the government will fully fund the Maths and English up to level 2. That is funded separately from the cap, so it's funding you get over and above the funding cap, and it's funded at 471 for each learning aid, regardless of the age of the apprentice. It's a flat rate. And the condition of funding for Maths and English applies to all the apprenticeships, whether they're standards or frameworks. What you may not know is if a level 3 Maths and English is required by the employer or the standard, then it has to be funded from the co-payment and included in the pricing agreement between you and your employer. It's not paid for by the cap funding. So if an employer wants a level 3 in Maths or English, they basically have to pay for it. So you'll need to negotiate with them about how much they're going to pay for that particular qualification if they want to add it in. The other thing to be aware of is the government will not fund any learners to take an apprenticeship at the same level, except if they are moving to a completely new sector and there is a significant amount of new learning to take place, requiring delivery obviously over the minimum duration of a standard. So for example, a graduate who's got a level 6 degree would be expected to do a level 7 apprenticeship. In the same way as if you've got a learner who's 22 that's taken an out 19 plus FE loan and taken a level 4 qualification and they want to then do an apprenticeship, they would have to do a level 5 apprenticeship if it was in the same sector subject area. They can't expect to do another apprenticeship at level 4. And finally, there's one other thing that I think is quite interesting, and that is if an employer wants to include another qualification in the standard that is not an intrinsic part of that apprenticeship standard, you can do so, and you can actually map the modules of that qualification to the standard. If all the modules map to the standard, then the employer doesn't have to pay anything. But if you found that only 1 or 2 modules mapped to it, and there were still 5 or 6 modules, then the employer is required to pay for those extra modules over and above the apprenticeship standard cap. So you can add in qualifications, but the employer does need to pay, but you can also map those in, and what isn't included is the only part that the employer has to pay for. So other sort of apprenticeship rules which are worth being aware of. Basically, first of all, on the sort of defined core principles, as you can see there, it's a job and a skilled occupation. The one thing to be aware of is that it must be substantial and sustained training lasting a minimum of 12 months and involving at least 20% off-the-job training. So 1 day a week, the learner must not be doing their job. They can be learning online at work, they can be having day releases with providers, but they can't be doing their job. They've got to be off the job, learning the aspects of the job. They can't actually learn whilst doing it. It's got to develop those transferable skills, that's the English and maths. It's also got to lead to full competency and capability in the occupation, and that is demonstrated by the achievement of the standard and the end assessment. It should train the apprentice to the level required for professional recognition and professional certification where it exists relating to that standard. So if there's a professional certificate to enable that learner to work in that particular sector or that particular occupation, it should train them to the level where they can take that professional certificate. So on to the actual process. Provider and employer, you negotiate with them to agree a price for the training and endpoint assessment. The employer can specify which endpoint assessment they want you to use. So if you contract it with a particular endpoint assessment, endpoint assessment organisation, you may not always be able to use them. Although obviously as the experts, you can influence your employer as to which endpoint assessment organisation they wish to use. The apprenticeship agreement, this is the after you've finished your negotiations, this establishes a clear contract, and it also includes the payment schedule, which is when you and the employer have agreed that the employer is going to make payments to you as a provider. The statement of commitment is signed by all parties and makes the roles and responsibilities clear. That's employer, provider, apprentice, and in the case of 16 to 18-year-olds, the parent, who also has to sign the statement of commitment. Now down there I've given a link, the www.gov Government Publication Apprenticeship Standards Funding Rules. In that set of funding rules, in that enormous document, there is quite a good flow chart with a lot of information about how the endpoint assessment, the apprenticeship agreement, the statement of commitment should be managed by yourself as providers or by employers and by you. So it's worth downloading that document and having a look at that process because it is quite comprehensive. So just to sort of reiterate on that, I think we've got a poll. Oh yes, we've got a poll to go now, ladies and gentlemen. So Belinda's just going to take you through another poll.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and Bryony's going to start talking a little bit about the agreement process. And before that, we wanted to ask you, have you considered a pricing structure for your apprenticeship offer? And if so, how far along are you in developing it? The answers being fully developed pricing structure, working on it currently, considered it but not yet taken it further, or pricing structure. What pricing structure? Okay, thank you. So about 70% of you are considering it but have not yet taken it further. So if we move on to the next slide. And over to you, Bryony.
Okay, so written agreements. This needs to be a legal watertight document for you, whether you're an employer or whether you're a provider. It needs to be a document that makes sure you are safe. For example, what happens if the apprentice drops out? What happens if the apprentice is made redundant because the employer decides to restructure? All of those aspects of and changes that might potentially occur should be in the written agreement and should state very clearly what both parties will do should this occur, i.e. that the provider would still get a certain amount of payments to make sure that they've paid for the delivery that they have done. And it really does need to be a legal watertight document. So if you haven't engaged with some sort of legal specialist that looks at contracts, or you don't have someone in-house that can do that for you, it would be really sensible to do that to make sure that the pro forma document that you finally settle on keeps you safe, whether you're an employer or whether you're a provider. It should look at when the employer is going to make payments for you from their to providers for their levy account. The payment schedule needs to be very clear, and obviously again pick up on those aspects of what happens if an apprentice leaves and the provider's already delivered a certain amount but actually they haven't been paid for it. And again, as I said before, the provider cannot draw down any funding from the Skills Funding Agency or from levy until you prove from the employer that they've paid their contribution. So does the employer need to pay for any extras? That should be included in the written agreement. It should be included in the payment schedule. Will they be paying for a qualification? Will they be paying for modules of a qualification because you've mapped that qual into the standard? What will happen if you currently subcontract apprenticeship delivery? If you're currently subcontracting part of your apprenticeship delivery, it's entirely possible, if you're a provider, that the employer that your subcontractor is working with may approach that subcontractor directly and ask them to deliver directly, cutting out the prime provider that currently provides the funding. So having conversations with your subcontractors and those employers right now would also be a sensible move to make sure you're very clear about where you are. Which apprenticeships will you deliver? And also, I think importantly, but certainly for the employers that we spoke to, because we've recently done some employer events on the levy and the apprenticeship, one of the things that they flagged is a simple pricing structure that they understand for what you're going to deliver and how would be really, really important. Most large employers are already looking at that and they'll come to you with some ideas, but some of the smaller and medium-sized employers will really expect you to come at them with some sort of pricing structure that they can easily understand, and obviously it also would be good if it was something that your staff can understand easily as well. So getting that in place in readiness, or to have in discussion with employers if you're starting to work towards that now, will make life for them and for you a lot easier, and will obviously place providers in a good position for negotiations, because you'll all understand where you're coming from. The other thing to think about is economy of scale. If an employer wants you to deliver more than one apprenticeship, i.e. 10 or 20, how much of a discount could you afford, or can you afford to discount? And when do you walk away? And I think this is really important. There will be some employers that will come to providers with unrealistic expectations of how much their levy they're going to spend on an individual apprenticeship. And if you've already got a pricing structure in place that says, right, we know that the minimum amount we could deliver this for if we were delivering 20 apprenticeships is this amount per apprentice. If the employer comes to you with unrealistic expectations, you can then say, actually, we can't do this. It's not financially feasible for us. And you can then walk away and leave them with your pricing structure, and then they make the decision. Because what shouldn't be happening is providers should not be delivering at a loss. That's not where you want to be, and certainly I don't think where employers would want you to be, but they may have unrealistic expectations. So that's the apprenticeship process. And just quickly, on the next slide, just slide through. I've done a step-by-step process here. So the employer selects a chosen provider from DAS, and obviously they come and see you and want to discuss what you're going to deliver them and what should be what they should be informed and what the incentives are that they might be able to claim, what standards and what the funding caps are that you can deliver in, and really how much you're actually going to agree to deliver that apprenticeship or apprenticeships for. Step 2, the initial negotiations take place. As I've mentioned, you need a pricing structure, or it would be much better for you and employers if you've got a pricing structure. And also at that point you would decide which endpoint assessment organisation you would use, and if the employer may already have decided which one they want to use. Step 3, the employer recruits the apprentice. Providers check the eligibility and what other support may be needed. Is there other learning support that may be needed that you can claim? So it's down to the provider to check eligibility, obviously age, and also any other support needed for that particular learner. Step 4, and this is really the big one, this is when the final written agreement and legal contract between you and the employer needs to be agreed and then set out in writing with the financial agreement. You sign it off, the provider signs it off, it has a payment schedule, and then the employer and the apprentice sign the individual commitment statement. And at this point, again, just click on again, this is the point where if you've got a 16 to 18-year-old apprenticeship, the parent also needs to be engaged and involved and must sign that agreement saying that they will support the young person to do that apprenticeship and make sure they turn up at work and do all the other things that you would potentially want in that sort of commitment agreement. Step 5, you create the apprenticeship evidence pack. Now this is a pack which basically is a single point of reference relating to training and endpoint assessment. It's not so much different from the learner information that you would currently collect. It's going to have some different documents in it, for instance the commitment statement. You'd also at this point set up your ILR registration and ensure that the cash contribution from the employer, particularly if they're paying you, you've persuaded them to pay some money up front, is recorded on the ILR to enable you to then claim the government funding. And then obviously step 6, once you've been through the apprenticeship and the ILR's triggered your payments on a regular basis, you get to the endpoint assessment and you pay the endpoint assessment, and you also pay any remaining incentives to the employer. And the endpoint assessment organisation claims your certificate, so you can pay the completion incentive to the employer if they're due one. I hope that makes the process a little bit easier to understand and a little bit clearer for everybody. We've got a poll question now on what you've just heard. Obviously, if you've got any questions, we'll field them at the end, and we'll go away and find them out if we can't actually answer them today. But if we can just move to the poll. Belinda,
thank you, Bryony. So, with regards to the new apprenticeship processes and ensuring funding, how ready are your staff and MIS departments to implement the changes? So you can tick all that apply, fully ready with an implementation plan, aware and preparing an implementation plan, aware and not preparing anything yet, not aware and needing briefing or training. Okay, so about 70% aware but not yet preparing anything.
So just finally, before we move on to some final poll questions, one of the things that City and Guilds and I've been working very hard on is workshops that we can offer you as providers, or groups of providers probably would be better. There are a lot of reforms coming at everybody over the course of the next 8 to 12 months. The adult education budget will reform as from the 1st of August this year. Devolution will start in 2017, and that will mean some massive changes for providers. and also your local authorities, combined authorities and LEPs, the apprenticeship reforms, the adult learner loan reforms, and also how to maximise funding in the new landscape. The sort of workshops we'd be running would really enable you to be completely ready for all of the reforms that are coming, but also offer information and advice on how to maximise your funding in the new landscapes and where the funding opportunities are in the new landscapes that are coming at us over the next 2 years. So we can offer those workshops to groups of providers or individual providers, and we will be running some strategic workshops in May, one in London and one up in the north, probably in our Wakefield office for groups of providers. So look out on our website for those workshops. We'll be running them for large groups of providers in those two offices, but we can come to you if need be. So please do contact me if you're interested in them, and I'll flag that up to our events team who will start getting them organised. So that's what those are, much more comprehensive workshops. They're 2.5, 3 hours, maybe 3.5 hours long, and we'll take you through absolutely everything so that you're completely ready, up to speed, and know how to plan a strategy for maximising your funding. I think we're on to questions now. So if anybody's got any questions, or we've been feeding through questions, I think Belinda's going to fire some at me and I'm going to try to answer them.
I have, absolutely. Thank you, Bryony. Okay, so we first of all have a question about the funding caps. As an example, if the funding band was 4, are we saying that potentially we could receive £4,000 in funding for one learner? A little bit more clarity on exactly how this works would be great.
Okay, so if the funding cap was, if your employer was prepared to pay £4,000, for instance, if it was funding cap 4, the employer contribution is 4,000, you would receive 8,000 from the employer. So your funding cap 4, the actual full amount for that would be £12,000, as long as your employer was prepared to pay the £4,000 up front. So the reality is you get 12,000, but if the employer only wants to pay 3,000, then you will only get 6,000 from the government and 3,000 from the employer. So no, it's actually the employer contribution you get as well as the core government contribution. It's a 1/3 from the employer and a 2/3 from the government. Whatever third you get from the employer, if it's £2,000, you get £4,000 from the government. If it's £3,000 from the employer, you get £6,000 from the government. Does that answer that question? Hopefully it does.
Do send another comment if it doesn't. That question was from a lady called Jenny. Okay, so another one. Is the incentive payment only for small businesses?
The small business incentive payment is, yes, only for small businesses with less than 50 employees. But there are also incentive payments for recruiting a 16 to 18-year-old. And obviously there's the successful completion, which obviously if the apprentice completes, all employers get that, and all employers get the recruiting a 16 to 18-year-old. But there's a third incentive, which is just for small businesses of less than 50 staff.
Lovely, thank you. And Jenny came back saying, yes, that did answer her question. So thank you, Jenny.
Great. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay, a question here about the SACE apprenticeships. Will there be no further SACE apprenticeship starts allowed from the 1st of August 2017 where trailblazers are not yet available?
No, if there isn't a trailblazer available, then you can still use the framework, and the frameworks will remain in place until they've been replaced by an apprenticeship standard. The Skills Funding Agency is currently looking at each apprenticeship standard that is written and approved for delivery. And if you log on to the government website and look and put in apprenticeship standards, you can get a list of those that are ready for delivery and those that are being developed. Once an apprenticeship standard is ready for delivery, the Skills Funding Agency will compare it to an apprenticeship standard that's similar, and if they think it fully replaces that apprenticeship framework, they will remove the apprenticeship framework and replace it with the standard. In actual fact, they removed 7 apprenticeship frameworks this week, but from 1st of August 2017 you can still deliver apprenticeship frameworks if it hasn't been removed by the SFA, and so far they've only removed 7 of them. They did advertise that on their website about a week ago. If anybody wants a list of which apprenticeship frameworks that is, then give me a shout and I'll send you a list of them. Actually, we can put that. We'll send that out on the Q&A. As part of the Q&A, we'll include the list of apprenticeship frameworks that have been removed on the Q&A. But no, you can still deliver frameworks from the 1st of August as long as they're still available.
Thank you. So another one about employer contribution linking to the funding caps. Does employer contribution have to be in cash or can it be in kind?
No, it has to be in cash. You have to be able to prove that the employer has paid you their cash contribution, and you can evidence that on your ILR in the form of invoices or whatever.
Okay, thank you very much. So a question now about the levy. What percentage of the levy that you pay via HMRC is put into your DAS account?
Oh, no, that's a good question. What the government has said is that they've said that you should be able to put in, you should be able to get out more than you put in. I'm very wary of this at the moment, and we don't really have any clarity on this. We may get more clarity in the budget next week from George Osborne, but I think we'll probably have to wait actually until August this year before we get more clarity on that. They've said that the employers that pay the levy will be able to put in a certain amount, and they'll get out more, i.e. they can deliver more apprenticeships and get more money. I think it very much depends on how canny employers are. I'm sure that there are employers out there that are going to be very canny with their levy account and will look to use it up completely and potentially then ask for more. At the same time, there may well be employers out there that won't use the levy at all. I'm sure that some of them are going, we just can't, we've got, you know, our own internal training processes and we're going to stick with them regardless of the fact we pay the levy. I really don't think the government is clear yet. So how much of a percentage you'll get back on what you pay in? You should, according to the government, be able to get everything back that you pay in and more. But they may come to us in the autumn and say something like they're going to top slice the levy to pay for the SMEs. We just don't know. So I think it's very much a wait and see. And I think for the government, there's also some juggling and some analysis for them to do to really come up with a model that is acceptable to everybody. So by autumn, we should know more, and I'll be able to hopefully give you a bit more information at that time. But at the moment, we're sticking with that comment that the government said: you put in what you get in, you'll get out what you put in, and you should be able to get out more.
Thanks, Bryony. Question here: what is the digital apprenticeship voucher redeemed against?
Redeemed against provider delivery. So the delivery is the delivery that an education provider makes of that apprenticeship inside the employer's premises, or whether it's the 20% that happens off-site and the apprentice comes to them for day release. Basically, it's redeemed against the delivery of that apprenticeship standard for the duration of that apprenticeship standard, whether that's 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, however long.
Excellent, thank you very much. Another question. So you said that direct funding from the SFA would be switched off from the 1st of August 2017. Yes. Will this also apply to safe starts after this date?
Yes. It applies basically from 1st of August 2017. You will no longer receive any funding from the Skills Funding Agency for apprenticeships. It must come to you directly via the Digital Apprenticeship Service and the employers. So starting those conversations with employers now about what they want delivered then, and getting those payment schedules and payment arrangements set up before the 1st of August so that you've still got funding coming in, will be really important over the course of the next 15 months.
Thank you very much. Another question we receive often is who is liable to pay the levy? Does it include colleges, charities?
It includes everybody. There is absolutely no employer is exempt from the levy if they've got a pay bill above 3 million. So everybody has to pay it. It doesn't matter whether you're a charity or whether you're a public body.
Thank you. And another question we receive often, this hasn't come in today, so do keep sending in your questions, ladies and gentlemen. A question we receive often: is this just government getting even more money out of employers and giving nothing back? Are the government putting money in to apprenticeship?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, certainly at the last comprehensive spending review last November, one thing that was made clear is that there would be no cuts to the adult education budget. Again, we know obviously it's been cut. Any provider that's online will know that their adult education budget has been cut since 2012 on a year-on-year basis. But they haven't made any cuts to the adult education budget. So they're still funding other qualifications outside of apprenticeships. And all indications that I've had so far is that for those employers that are not paying the levy, there is still the intention for the government to commit funding to that aspect of apprenticeship delivery. But I think we really have to wait and see. The person who holds the purse strings, George Osborne, may have a different point of view, and we're not really going to know anything until autumn of this year, I don't think. But so far, all the comments we're receiving is that there will still be some sort of government money going into apprenticeships on an ongoing basis. And Nick Bowles did also say that at the AOC conference last year as well. So one assumes they'll still be committing some sort of funding, but we don't know how and we don't know where.
Excellent, thank you. Another question about employer contribution. How does that work if an employer gains a direct grant?
Well, employers that gain a direct grant, there's a big section in the funding rules about direct grants and how that works. If you receive a direct grant, you've got a choice. You'll have to set up finance systems inside your own organisation that enable you to pay yourself for delivering your apprenticeships. You may subcontract that to a provider or subcontract part of that to an education provider to do some of your delivery. The one thing you have to be very clear on is that endpoint assessment is completely separate from any delivery, and that anybody involved in delivery has nothing to do with endpoint assessment. So whether you use an outside organisation like City and Guilds, because we are an endpoint assessment organisation, or whether you set up an endpoint assessment organisation for yourselves and keep it separate, you have to be very clear. And I think this is really important for the quality of apprenticeships as well. What we want is an apprentice that does an apprenticeship up in Newcastle to be able to take that certificate down to his next job or her next job if they move down to the south of the country because they get married or whatever the reason is, and be able to show that apprenticeship certificate that says, actually, I took this qualification, and for the employer wherever they move to also recognise that certificate. And for all sectors to end up with a pool of skilled candidates that you as employers or employers can recruit from. And that means everybody ensuring the quality of apprenticeships. So I think it will vary with direct grant, and there's still some information to come out about direct grant employers. But basically, yes, you can still get a direct grant. As an employer, you can apply for a direct grant to deliver your own apprenticeships under the levy. And I know that the next year's funding rules will have a lot more information about how that will work. We expect them to be published at the end of this year or very early next year, and that'll be for the 1st of August 2017.
Picking up again on that date, the 1st of August 2017, if a provider signs up apprentices on the 30th of July 2017, will they be funded through the allocation process, or will the allocation cease the day after?
You will be funded for that apprentice through the allocation process until the end of their apprenticeship. The SFA has made very clear in their funding rules that if you start a course in year, you're funded in the methodology of that particular year's funding, which means you'll still be funded. So the apprenticeship levy kicks in on the 1st of August. Anything before that is paid ongoing by the Skills Funding Agency. So yes, you could start 1,000 apprentices on the 31st of July 2017 and you'd still be funded for them for that year until they'd finished. Anything else you start on the 1st of August will be funded by the levy.
Thank you. Do we have any information about funding in Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland for apprentices, and does the levy go to them?
Well, the government is collecting the levy from right across the UK, but the way that it will work is they will allocate that money back into the devolved nations, so they'll allocate money back into Scotland and Wales. It seems to be at the moment that they will probably not get as much money as maybe is collected, but they will use it in a different way because both Scotland and Wales, for instance, Wales is sticking with apprenticeship frameworks. They are not moving to standards. They have a completely different approach. So realistically, they will get some money. It'll be allocated along some sort of formula. We don't quite know what that formula is going to be yet. The Barnett formula, which has always been used up to this date, has been mooted, but they may change that. So yes, they'll get some money back, but they will use it in a completely different way. They don't necessarily have to use it to standards because their approach and their system is different in those two nations.
Lovely, thank you very much. So another question about direct grants. Following on from the direct grant from employers, does the government still pay the contribution?
It depends on the size of the employer. If you've got if you're a pay bill of 3 million or more, no, you'll pay the levy and the government won't pay any contribution. If you're a direct grant employer that's actually not got a pay bill of 3 million, then yes, at the moment the government is saying they will still pay a contribution. But again, we won't know until probably autumn how the non-levy paying employers' contributions and payment of apprenticeships is going to work. So we'll need to wait for another 6 or 8 months on that one.
Thank you. And with regards to those employers with a direct grant and claiming funding for the learner, we've got Jenny here asking a question about what happens with negotiating prices with providers, and how would employers know how much to pay themselves? Presumably the negotiation is the same and the money comes out of their voucher?
Yes. It comes out of their digital levy system if they pay the levy. And as an employer, it's really down to you to negotiate with the provider about how much money they're going to get for the delivery, and they'll be down to the provider to say yes or no to that. And it also depends on where the apprenticeship standard that's being delivered sits within funding caps, because that's a basis for the funding caps. Assess how much it would really cost to deliver that apprenticeship if it was really done at the maximum level. So it's really down to employers and providers to negotiate within that. Get yourself an economy of scale. For instance, if your provider's delivering 30 apprenticeships, then there can be some discounts potentially. It's really down to the employer and the provider to make those negotiations once the levy kicks in on the 1st of August. It's totally between those two bodies as to what you agree and how much is delivered for the levy that the employer has got.
Excellent. Okay. Another comment from Jenny. She's saying, sorry, I didn't explain it properly.
Okay.
If we are the employer and we have our own grant and delivery team, I'm wondering how it works with funding and caps, as we wouldn't be negotiating with the provider, as essentially we would be the provider.
All right, Jenny. Yes, sorry, I see where you're coming from. Well, yes, then it's really down to you to work out how much you can actually deliver for the levy that you've got to spend. What you do need to be aware of, I mean, if you are actually the provider per se, obviously you'd have to be on Roto, and it's, you know, what levy you'll get. It'll be there in your digital apprenticeship account, and it'd be much like a training budget to a certain extent. You would use it to deliver everything. The one thing you would have to be very clear on is that 20% off the job training, because that's part of the apprenticeship quality standard. So it's just that to be aware of. But then it's really down to you what you do with it. As a direct grant, well, you'd be a provider, so you're a provider that delivers your own training using the apprenticeship levy. But it would have to be apprenticeships that you deliver. You can't use it for delivering anything else.
Lovely, thank you.
Does that answer the question, Jenny?
Jenny says thanks.
Great.
Lovely. Okay, so we have another question about Wales. What happens if an employer in Wales uses a provider in England in terms of the levy standards and frameworks?
Yeah, that one's going to be a sticky one. At the moment, the Skills Funding Agency does state in their rules that a provider cannot deliver with apprenticeship funding inside one of the nations, because the nations have their own funding pot. I think that it states somewhere in the rules that there might be the occasional anomaly, but the reality is Wales has their own funding, so apprenticeships in Wales should take place in Wales with Welsh providers. English providers have their own money, therefore they will deliver to apprentices in England. So at the moment, there's not really much movement across borders.
That's lovely. Well, I think, there's one more. We'll take one more and then we will wrap up. This is a question. Will the standards be running smoothly by 2017?
I think there's going to be it's going to be a timeline. The standards, there's lots of standards being developed at the moment. I think there's somewhere in the region of about 300 or so being developed at the moment. But some of them have been rejected and sent back to the standards governance group by the department and by the minister. They don't like them. They don't think the quality is good enough. Certainly the Institute for Apprenticeships is going to be looking at standards to make sure that they are fit for purpose and they do enable the individual learner and the employer to get what they need out of that standard. It's not just the 10 or 20 employers that will be developing that standard. There is a website called Citizen Space, and once an apprenticeship standard is signed off as ready for, just before it's signed off as ready for delivery, all apprenticeship standards are put up on Citizen Space for everybody else to consult on. So you may have 10 employers, that's the minimum amount of employers that are allowed to develop the standard, they can't have any less. Once those 10 or 12 employers, or however many it is, have developed the standard, that consultation process enables smaller organisations or other organisations that have not been involved in developing the standard to actually take a look at it and feedback whether they think it's fit for purpose. So it's going to be a long process. I think by 2020, this is the government's intention, I think it's feasible, we will have completely swapped over to standards from frameworks. But I think that during 2017, 2018 and probably 2019, we will still be running some frameworks, but they will slowly drop off. And by 2020, we should have made that full transition to apprenticeship standards.
That's lovely. There is one more, so we'll take it and then we will wrap up. So this is if an employer pays for the whole apprenticeship programme at the start of the programme and the apprentice does not complete it, how is clawback envisaged?
Well, that again is really down to that written payment, that written agreement and the payment schedule between you and the provider. This is where it's so important to make it a legal watertight document, taking into consideration all those points, such as the employer paying fully up front. What happens if he leaves halfway through? The provider should pay you back half of potentially what has been paid. But it's really down to that initial negotiation between the provider and the employer about when payments take place, what happens if an apprentice leaves. That is totally open to negotiation and down to you to agree. No one is stating what should happen and when. Inside the Skills Funding Agency funding rules for apprenticeship standards, there are some hints and tips on what you might want to think about if there are changes. So we've given the link inside the slides. We will be sending that out. It's worth looking at that changes section in the standards rules, because that gives you some hints and tips about what you should do and what you might want to think about. But it is totally open to negotiation. That's why it should be a legal watertight document for both the provider and the employer to make sure you're both safe. I think that's it, everybody. Thanks very much. Do contact me if you'd be interested in much more comprehensive funding workshops at a more sort of strategic and planning level, which will look at all the other aspects of the reforms as well. But I think that's it for today. Thank you very much. And we'll be sending the slides and the Q&A out to everybody sometime in the next few days. Thank you.